for Luke and Acts is that it was written in order that when Paul goes before this grand Roman official, before he goes before Caesar himself, that Luke is writing all of these things in order that Paul's trial might go well. That he might say, Paul is a man who is not worthy of death, but rather he is living in the footsteps of Christ, and he's a man who has done a worthy cause. And when you come against Paul, you're also coming against the church, and more than this, you're coming against Christ himself. And we see both in the martyrdom of Stephen, in the persecution against Paul and the persecution against the church, that the church only continues to grow in all of these things. And that there is truth in this statement that we, like the early church, when the world, when Satan, when rebellious men and women, sinners come against the people of God, they don't only attack us, they attack the God whom we serve. We are Christians, and that word literally means little Christs. We are walking in the footsteps of Christ. When we are attacked, when we are assaulted, Christ himself is put on trial as well. And we know if that was the thesis, if that was the reason for Luke writing the letter, for the government official to hear Paul's case and not to give him a penalty in the court of law, history tells us what actually happened to Paul. Now, it's not recorded in the Bible, but there are many historical accounts of the death of Peter and Paul. Usually those deaths actually go together historically. And we can calculate that it was in the 60s AD that Paul was put to death, but there's a lot of different stories of how he was put to death. I think the most popular opinion is that because he was a Roman citizen, he wasn't able to be crucified as Christ was crucified, but instead he was beheaded. But that is still conjecture, but it's a truth nonetheless that Paul certainly died, and he died at the hand of persecution. And so if the letter's intent, if Luke wrote Luke and Acts in order that Paul would not have the consequence and the penalty of law, and he was killed as a result, we might say that Luke and Acts, the books didn't do their job. At least not the one that the human author intended. And this is one of the most beautiful things throughout the Bible that I see, is this understanding that we see all the way back in Genesis, that we'll see in the book we're going into in Romans, that God works out all things for good for those who trust in him, and what men plan for evil, God uses for good. Could it be that Luke wrote Luke and Acts with the intention that he might save Paul's life, and really what he ended up doing is recording the earliest days of the Christian church? And in so doing this, gave us timeless accounts of the witness of God's people, that we can see God moving in his church even in the earliest of times. Even if that wasn't his purpose to give a history, nonetheless he did it, and God has used that and blessed that, and it's become a part of the canon of Scripture itself. That's an awesome thing. And so when we look at kind of what I would say is the thesis of why he wrote these things, and we say, well, it didn't actually turn out the way he wanted it, God uses, even in those evil acts, things that they might come out for good. And as we exit out of Acts, as we put the 2-volume work that compares Paul and Jesus and shows us how the church came to be what it is now, we're encouraged by the historical account that overlies all of this, that God's church did increase and did spread. And now we're about to turn to the book of Romans. And with it, many of the epistles that Paul himself, the letters that Paul himself wrote. And one of the things that Acts does that is so great is that it gives us a narrative framework in which we might look at these epistles, and we can know what Paul was doing at the time of the writing, where he was at the time of the writing, where he was going to go next. And we can track all of that narratively and put that letter in a time and a place within the grand scheme of God's histories. And that helps us in reading them to see the larger context behind those things.